She could hear the mob outside, still angry, still riled up, but at least it was better now than it was earlier. Just a few hours ago, this group had rampaged through the palace, killing several of the guards as they went room by room. They had been hunting for her, calling out her name. Many in the mob wanted to see her dead. She had managed to escape by slipping into her husband's bedchambers, which were well guarded. The king at least still had some goodwill among the people, but she did not. It had been like that for some time. At first she had been warmly welcomed by the people of this country, but years of slanderous accusations, never mind that business with the necklace, had destroyed her reputation. She was seen as the enemy, and ever since the revolution had broken out she felt less and less safe in her own country, and now not even inside her own home. Negotiations were underway. The Marquis, the leader of the National Guard soldiers, was trying to defuse the situation by finding some way to appease the mob. What would happen next, she did not know. All she knew was that she had to keep her family safe, no matter what. After more time passed, the Marquis entered and asked her husband to address the mob. She did not like this man, but right now he was on their side. After a few more moments, the king nodded and headed out to a nearby balcony to meet with the crowd. Not long after, she could hear the cries, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" The cries allowed her to relax a bit. At least her husband was safe. Then a few moments later, the Marquis came back with her husband, and the next words caused her relief to drain away. It was her presence that was now being asked for, herself and her children. These people could have murdered her only a few hours ago, but there was no other option now. She kept her children close as she made her way onto the balcony, trying to shield them as much as she could from the mob down below. There was hatred in the eyes of many as they gazed upon her. She could even see a few muskets among them. Some of them were being pointed in her direction. The next demand the mob uttered chilled her to the core. They were asking for the children to be taken away from her. She was terrified at the very idea of this mob getting any closer to her children. But if she said no, what would happen? Would those muskets pointed at her open fire? Would this be the end? She stood her ground upon the balcony, holding her hands to her chest, trying to remain as calm as she could in the face of all this. This might very well be the end, and these people may have hated her, but she had to remain strong, at the very least, for her son and daughter beside her. After a few tense moments of this standoff, things started to calm slightly. The crowd was looking upon this queen that they blamed for much of what was wrong with the nation, and they saw someone who was standing her ground, not cowering in the face of their hostility and threats. Increasingly, they were not seeing the hated queen, but a mother trying to protect her family. Sensing this shift in the mood, the Marquis looked to her for a few moments, seeming to have an idea. He then slowly knelt onto the floor of the balcony, reached up to take her right hand, then kissed the back of it in front of the crowd. This showy display seemed to be just what was needed at that moment. The rage in the mob began to subside at this respectful gesture, and then she heard it. It was a sound she had not heard in a very long time, and had expected to never hear again. She did not know how long this moment would last, but at least today, her family would remain safe. Long live the Queen! Long live the Queen! Marie Antoinette Joseph Jean d'Autriche-Lorraine, or Marie Antoinette, is a rider-class servant in Fate Grand Order, and probably the most famous of all French queens. Marie has been a part of Fate Grand Order's cast since the beginning, having a prominent role in the Orléans Singularity, as well as being a feature of numerous events over the years, most notably during summer events and the Fate Requiem Collaboration Event. Her personality is one of a friendly, loving teen who befriends easily, and is the source of a few memorable lines. But behind the scenes lurks a darker side that she tries to keep away from everyone else. But who is the real Marie Antoinette? The first thing to say about Marie Antoinette is that she was not born with that name. Rather, it is a different form of her actual birth name, Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna von Österreich-Lothringen. If that doesn't sound very French to you, it's because it isn't. It's actually German. Maria Antonia was born in Vienna, Austria, on the 2nd of November, 1755, to the Empress Maria Theresa and her husband, Emperor Francis I, being the 15th of 16 children. That's a lot. As you might have guessed from the titles of her parents, Maria was born into royalty, the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. This house was actually created by the union of her two parents, Maria Theresa of Habsburg and Francis of Lorraine. Now, the House of Habsburg is arguably the most notable royal dynasty in European history, and I'm going to have to take a few minutes to give a summary of their long, long history, because it will become relevant to Marie Antoinette's story. To sum it up, the Habsburgs were initially a small Swiss noble family that, through centuries of inheritance, marriage alliances, and sometimes just luck, ended up becoming the most powerful family in Europe during the 16th century. How powerful? Well, Charles V, who reigned from 1519 to 1556, was the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Archduke of Austria, King of Spain, and Duke of Burgundy, which includes much of what is today Eastern France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. It was also during Charles V's reign that saw the Spanish conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires, meaning you can also add a vast empire in the Americas to the Habsburg holdings in Europe. Things started to crack after the aging Charles V's abdication, whereupon the Austrian bits went to his younger brother Ferdinand I, and the Spanish bits went to his son Philip II. This split the Habsburgs into two separate states, but since they were literally family, Spain and Austria stuck together as allies. Then came the year 1700, when the last of the Spanish Habsburgs died without an heir, whereupon the Spanish throne passed to Philip of Anjou, a grandson of King Louis XIV of France. Terrified of the idea of France and Spain uniting under a single ruler, like how Spain and Austria did in the 16th century, this led to the outbreak of a war called, conveniently, the War of Spanish Succession. This war dragged on for 13.5 years until a peace was agreed, which accepted Philip of Anjou as King of Spain, but required that he renounce any claim to the French throne, and that a bunch of Spanish lands were handed over to the Austrians and the British, including Gibraltar, which is still in British hands today. The Austrian Habsburgs saw how their Spanish cousins had died out and had a succession crisis leading to a major European war, and decided it'd be fun to try that out for themselves. Okay, they didn't actually want that, but it is how things turned out. Rather than completely dying out, the Emperor Charles VI had the problem of having no male heirs. Despite getting laws changed so women could inherit, and getting other nations to agree that his daughter would be accepted upon his death, once Charles VI died, well, we got the War of Austrian Succession. Not quite like House of the Dragon, but not too far off either in that the issue was people being mad about a woman inheriting titles that, until then, had only belonged to men, or just seizing an opportunity to get more things. Another 8 years of war followed, which ended in some notable territorial changes, a major shift in European alliances, and that female heir of Austria still on the throne. That female heir, by the way, was Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette's mother. My point in bringing all of that up was to say that Maria Antonia was born into one of the most esteemed families in Europe that had a very long history, but that history had quite a bit of baggage attached to it. The Habsburgs were at the center of European affairs for centuries, and so got involved in quite a few wars and developed rivalries with other great powers. As it turned out, their biggest rival up until this time was France. When the Habsburgs ruled both Austria and Spain, and modern Belgium, French concerns about this threat from the south, east, and north led to France doing what they could to weaken the Habsburgs whenever possible. Probably the most dramatic of these moves was when France, a Catholic nation, joined the ostensibly Protestant side of the 30 Years' War against the Catholic Habsburgs in 1635, leading to an eventual Protestant and French victory in 1648. In other words, France and Austria didn't exactly like each other and hadn't liked each other for centuries. While France's rivalry with the English was undoubtedly the biggest one, the French rivalry with the Habsburgs probably won silver. Now, why is all of this important? Well, because Maria Antonia was the daughter of a European royal family, and that meant that her fate was to be married off for the benefit of the Habsburg family. After the War of Austrian Succession ended in 1748, the centuries-long rivalry between France and Austria came to an end during a major alliance shift called the Diplomatic Revolution. What was this revolution? Well, Austria's main ally during the War of Austrian Succession was Britain, but that alliance didn't turn out so well. Austria lost Silesia to Prussia, and had seen their holdings in the Netherlands, today's Belgium, get overrun by the French. Britain didn't mind because they were an island and had the wooden wall of the Royal Navy. But for Austria they were now vulnerable and without a strong ally upon the continent aside from Russia, and Russia is far away. The end result was that Austria and France ended up teaming up, while the former French ally of Prussia joined with Britain. Maria Antonia was not even 6 months old when these new alliances found themselves at war in 1756 in what became known as the 7 Years' War. Maria's mother, Empress Maria Theresa, wanted Silesia back from the Prussians, but ultimately did not succeed. France and Austria were both weakened, being the defeated side of this war when it ended in 1763, but their alliance remained since they still had mutual interests. To further those interests, they agreed to a marriage alliance between Maria Antonia and the grandson of King Louis XV of France, Louis Auguste, who was now the heir to the French throne. But since Marie and Louis were both still children, this marriage would not happen for several years. In the meantime, Maria would spend her childhood in Vienna with her family. Being a member of one of the great families of Europe, Maria had the benefit of having private tutors for her education, but she proved to be a difficult student. A tutor who was dispatched from France to help in her eventual transition would describe her as having great character and being more intelligent than expected, but also lazy, frivolous, and hard to teach. The young Maria seemed more interested in singing, dancing, and playing the harp than writing or language. Oh, and also horses. The young Marie took up horse riding at an early age, and would continue with it throughout her life, seeming to be one of her favorite hobbies. At a later point, when she was queen, the king reportedly forbade her from riding horses, saying that it was too dangerous for a queen. They ended up compromising by allowing her to ride donkeys instead, which ended up becoming something of a fad in France during her life. Marie's love of horses, I'm guessing, is the reason why, in Fate Grand Order, she is a rider-class servant. But going back to music for a moment, Maria being royalty meant that she got all sorts of special opportunities, including being able to meet special guests who came to Vienna. One such visitor was a young boy from Salzburg, Austria, about 2 months younger than Maria. This boy, aged 7, and his elder sister, aged 11, were musical prodigies who were being taken by their parents all over Europe to demonstrate their talents. Supposedly, at one point during this visit, the boy slipped upon the palace floor, but was helped up by the young Maria, with the boy proposing marriage to Maria in response. While this incident might not have actually happened, I bring it up because of who that boy was: Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. In Fate Grand Order, the story acts as if this meeting did indeed happen like this, and that Maria and Mozart remained fond of each other, even if Mozart's hopes for a marriage were not to be. The marriage that was to be was the one between Maria and the French heir, Louis Auguste. In 1770, when Maria was 14 and Louis was 15, the marriage pact agreed years before was made official. Maria actually would have a proxy wedding first in Vienna, with one of her brothers acting the part of Louis, before making the journey to France to do the real wedding with Louis first at Compiègne and then at Versailles on the 14th and 16th of May, respectively, 1770. It was at this time that Maria changed her name of Maria Antonia to its French equivalent, Marie Antoinette. Upon the death of King Louis XV in 1774, Louis Auguste, now Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette became the new king and queen of France. Marie found herself in a foreign land, a foreign court, and with a new husband that was quite different from herself. And by different, I mean they were basically polar opposites. Louis was shy, indecisive, and preferred to spend his leisure time alone. Marie, by contrast, was outgoing, bold, and had a fondness for parties. Versailles was a very different place than the twin palaces of Hofburg and Schönbrunn in Vienna. The French court was highly ritualized, and often there were many witnesses to every event of note, even private ones. So the fact that Marie and Louis did not consummate their marriage for 7 years was public knowledge, and would be the first of many difficulties that would arise. The royal court in Versailles was the center of power in France, and so was absolutely full of courtiers, visitors, and those with ambition. In fact, Versailles was the 10th largest city in France at this time, with around 50,000 residents, 10,000 of whom worked at the palace. The lifestyle was enormously expensive, but those who could manage it found themselves well positioned to meet the most powerful figures in the realm and seek their favor. Such favor could come in many forms: money, government positions, influence, and so forth. But since the competition for such favor was fierce, the court at Versailles was full of intrigue, rumor, and rivalries. This was the sort of world that Marie had now stumbled into, and it was one she was unprepared for. Though she made a good first impression upon the common people of France, the court in Versailles was unfriendly and soon filled with rumors and slander about the new queen. The lack of progress in the new marriage made people wonder if Marie was having affairs with other men, or perhaps one of the ladies of the court. Her Austrian heritage made people question if she truly had the best interests of France at heart, or if she was working as an agent of her family back in Vienna. But perhaps most notable of all, Marie's interest in fashion, and the spending that came with that, were exaggerated to the point that such spending was seen to be destroying the state's finances. Whenever Marie would do something that seemed to match what these rumors said, try to promote the career of someone she favored, advocate for closer ties with Austria, or to receive a new estate to relax at, it served as confirmation bias and fueled the rumors even more. As more and more of these often slanderous rumors spread, first around the palace and then into wider French society, the queen's reputation cratered. One of the most notorious incidents caused by palace intrigue was what became known as the affair of the diamond necklace. King Louis XV had arranged for a pair of jewelers in Paris to create an exquisite diamond necklace for one of his mistresses in 1772. But by the time the necklace was actually finished years later, King Louis XV was dead, and this mistress had been exiled from the court. The jewelers offered the necklace to Marie Antoinette in 1778, but she was not interested. Several years later, however, in 1784, a former ambassador to Vienna, Cardinal de Rohan, was looking to get a ministerial post for himself. But the cardinal had a problem. The queen had met him while she still lived in Vienna, and had come to dislike him, and rumors that de Rohan had spread to Marie's mother made the relationship even more hostile. Cardinal de Rohan needed to win back the queen's favor if he wanted to get the government post that he sought. Into this situation came a woman named Jeanne de la Motte, a courier who had met de Rohan and convinced him that she had developed a friendship with the queen. Acting as an intermediary, she exchanged letters between Cardinal de Rohan and Marie that grew increasingly friendly, to the point that it seemed like the queen was developing a personal interest in de Rohan. Claiming that it was for the queen's charity work, Jeanne de la Motte borrowed large sums of money from the cardinal, and over time her reputation among courtiers grew as someone who was close to the queen. The jewelers, still holding on to that diamond necklace that they absolutely needed to sell because of how expensive it was to make, decided to contact Jeanne de la Motte to see if, using her influence with the queen, they could finally sell it off. Jeanne de la Motte then delivered letters from the queen to de Rohan, asking him to act as an intermediary to buy the necklace on her behalf. In the letters, the queen hoped that de Rohan could arrange for the necklace's purchase discreetly, so that it could not be claimed that Marie was wasting yet more public money. Using the letters to prove his credibility as an intermediary, de Rohan purchased the necklace from the jewelers, to be paid in installments over time. But when it came time for the first of those payments to be made, the money did not arrive. When the jewelers went to complain to the queen about the lack of payment, Marie said that she had not purchased the necklace and knew nothing of a deal to have the cardinal act as an intermediary. Upon arresting Cardinal de Rohan and seeing the letters that had been written, the truth became clear. Jeanne de la Motte, who had been acting as the intermediary between the queen and de Rohan, was a con artist. The whole affair came to public light in 1785 with the cardinal's arrest, as well as a public trial of those involved. Jeanne de la Motte was jailed, and de Rohan was acquitted, but the situation proved to be a disaster for Queen Marie. Despite the findings of the trial showing her to be blameless, the public persisted in believing that Marie really did want the necklace, and had actually engineered the whole plot in order to discredit and humiliate the cardinal. That the cardinal was promptly exiled after his acquittal only made this seem more credible, not because the cardinal had been dumb enough not to recognize that Marie's signature had been blatantly forged. The years and years of rumors and slander of the queen ensured that this was accepted as reality, and so the end result of the whole affair was the complete breakdown of Queen Marie's reputation. The public hated her, and now added fraud to the long list of things that Marie was accused of: extravagance, adultery, corruption, and indifference to the suffering of the population as the financial situation continued to get worse. That diamond necklace, by the way, is Marie's craft essence that you acquire at bond level 10. Even the queen's private life could not escape from intrigue. The royal couple eventually did consummate their marriage, and would produce 4 children, but since rumors of adultery had formulated, it was also suspected that these children were illegitimate. Now, while it is likely that Queen Marie really did have an affair with a Swedish count named Axel von Fersen, there is no evidence that any of the Queen's children were not from Louis. Another difficulty lay in the health of her children. 2 of them would die in childhood, before the outbreak of the Revolution. While child mortality was common during this time period, such personal tragedies were nevertheless devastating. Marie did try to counter the slander against her by presenting herself as a doting and affectionate mother, but by the time she tried this, her image among the French populace was damaged beyond repair. And now it is time for me to look at the tiny number of viewers my videos have, and promptly chase most of them away with this next subject: government finances. Yay! Now, for all one of you still with me, it is time to unpack and debunk the bit I mentioned earlier about Queen Marie's spending habits being the cause of the increasingly dire finances the French monarchy found itself in. While it is true that Marie had expensive tastes and did spend a good deal of money on things, the real cause of France's financial woes goes back to history's biggest source of state expenditure: war. As you may remember me mentioning earlier, France had lost a major war against Britain back in 1763, the 7 Years' War. This defeat was a humiliation, forcing France to give up a massive amount of territory in North America, including Quebec and all of the Louisiana Territory east of the Mississippi, to Britain. They would also hand over the rest of Louisiana to Spain, but Spain was ruled by a Bourbon cousin now, and so was an ally. France would get that part of Louisiana back in 1800. Only to sell it off to the United States 3 years later. Still, the point is, France lost a lot of land and prestige to Britain in 1763. So when Britain's American colonists began to rebel in 1775, France saw an opportunity for payback it could not resist. At first with money and weapons, then actually joining the war in 1778, French help proved decisive in ensuring American independence. But the cost was staggering. You see, during the war, France got itself a new finance minister, Jacques Necker, a Swiss Protestant banker who had built up a reputation as a financial wizard over the years, eventually getting him this job. Faced with the prospects of paying for a major war, Necker decided that the best way to do that was not by raising taxes or trying to cut expenses at the French court, but by taking out a bunch of high-interest loans. You can probably guess where this is going. France's debt ballooned from around 2 billion livres to over 3 billion during the course of the war. I suppose you could say that Jacques Necker was not a very good finance minister. One thing Necker was undoubtedly good at, though, was public relations. He did much to bolster his reputation, and as part of that he did something that was, until then, unprecedented in French history: a published account of the monarchy's finances available to the public. Published in 1781, this record, called the Compte Rendu Roi, showed an astonishing picture. Despite being involved in a major war with Britain, and with no new taxes levied, the French monarchy actually had a positive balance sheet. The extraordinary accounts, which is where the real cost of the war was recorded, was conveniently left out of this report. So to the French public, Necker looked like a financial genius, who was able to help the monarchy wage war without any new taxes, and with the royal balance sheet in the black. Now, Necker would lose his job a few months later thanks to some court intrigue, but his reputation held. This proved to be a major problem because when future finance ministers came into the office and saw what the actual situation was, well, as you might expect, they freaked out. The new minister after 1783, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, would develop extensive plans for reforms to improve the economy, make taxation more efficient, and all of those other things that were necessary to fix the situation. But he could not get these plans approved by the nobility, who would need to have their taxes raised to make this work. To the nobility, it all seemed like overkill to them. After all, was the financial situation really that bad? When Necker was in charge, things were great. The Compte Rendu he published said so. He didn't need to do all this reforming or create new taxes. Maybe Calonne is just bad at his job. The sad fact is, Necker's reputation was still solid, and so calling him out as an incompetent liar who had pushed France to the brink of bankruptcy was not an option. As the financial situation became untenable, King Louis XVI was forced to convene the Estates General, a body which had not been in session since 1614, in order to address the situation. But the world had changed much since 1614, and so the assembly of the three estates of clergy, nobility, and the common people respectively was seen as an opportunity for people to present grievances and suggest reforms. The Estates General was set to begin on the 5th of May, 1789. And where was Queen Marie Antoinette during all this? Well, she had become part of the King's Council, the first time a queen had done so since 1617. She would successfully lobby for Jacques Necker to get his job back in 1788, to try to restore public confidence since everyone still thought he was a genius. She even agreed with Necker's proposal to double the number of representatives in the Third Estate. But aside from that, things were as unpleasant as ever. The Queen was involved in political feuds, notably with the Duke of Orleans. The con artist from the diamond necklace affair, Jean de la Motte, had escaped prison, fled to England, and was now telling everyone she had an affair with the Queen. But worst of all was that her eldest son, Louis-Joseph, was suffering from tuberculosis. Louis-Joseph sadly would not survive, dying on the 4th of June, 1789, at the age of 7. This was the second child that the royal couple had lost, with a daughter, Sophie Beatrice, having died at only 11 months in 1787. The death of their eldest son and heir was devastating for both the king and the queen, but few others seemed to care. After all, that news had to compete with the growing drama of the ongoing Estates General. The argument there was focused upon reforms and representation. The proposal to double the representation of the Third Estate turned out to be meaningless, since they were still voting by order rather than voting by head, meaning that the clergy and nobility could outvote the commons 2-1. The Third Estate wanted all three orders to vote on issues in a collective body and to have one vote per representative. Since this meant that the clergy and nobility would have less power, naturally they resisted this. Well, some of them did. A number of the clergy, and even a few nobles, were sympathetic to the commons, and some, notably the Count of Mirabeau and the Abbé Sieyès, were actually among the Third Estate's representatives. This left the Estates General at an impasse, but it would not remain so. The orders split to meet in 3 separate locations, but the commons decided to go further by transforming themselves into a national assembly rather than merely the Third Estate, and inviting the members of the other 2 estates to join them. Under the advice of the Queen and his other advisors, the king then got the bright idea to order that the hall where the National Assembly met be closed on the 20th of June, 1789. This backfired when the National Assembly simply found another place to gather, a nearby tennis court. Further attempts to bring things back to the old estate system failed, and with most of the clergy and even some nobles now joining the new assembly, the situation was falling out of the monarchy's control. The king soon had to accept that the Estates General was dead, and he was now working with this new National Assembly, but the nobles who had still refused to join, and his council, were staunchly opposed. It was at this point that, under the advice of the Queen and other members of his council, the king fired Necker, who had been sympathetic to the commons. The firing of the popular Necker and warning signs of troops being recalled to Paris provoked worry among the population that the new assembly was about to be violently put down. Fights broke out between soldiers and civilians, and there was an urgent desire to acquire arms for the population to defend against the threat of incoming armies. Upon hearing a rumor that the Bastille, the famous prison in Paris for criminals and political dissidents, had a large cache of arms inside it, mobs stormed it, freed the prisoners, and took the garrison prisoner on the 14th of July, 1789. The French Revolution had begun. The king backed down, now accepting the new reality, and getting popular acclaim in return. Nobles who could not accept this started to flee the country, and a plan for a civil war to re-establish the old order, the first of who would become known as the émigrés. Over the next few months, the whole of the ancient regime and all of its feudal trappings were dismantled. The great fear spread across France, with peasants attacking landlords out of fear that they were plotting to undo all of the changes made by the revolution. Certainly not the last time such worries would arise. Oh, and Necker got his job back. He still had his reputation, though not for much longer as, surprise, the economy was still a total mess and he couldn't fix it. And to be fair to Necker, the dismantling of all the feudal structures effectively killed tax revenue. But I'm not very sympathetic since he played such a big role in causing this whole mess. Despite having popular support for having not marched an army into Paris to try to crush the revolution, the situation King Louis XVI found himself in was difficult. It was even worse for Queen Marie, still hated by most everyone, and having effectively become the scapegoat for everything that was wrong inside France. This would come to a head when, on the 5th of October 1789, A mob of women rioting about bread prices marched on Versailles. The mob was followed by National Guardsmen, but soon broke into the palace, killed a few guards, and went actively hunting for the Queen. With muskets pointed in her direction, only the Queen's bravery and the actions of the head of the National Guard detachment, the Marquis de Lafayette, managed to defuse the situation enough to keep the Queen from being murdered. Yes, this is the same Lafayette that fought in George Washington's army during the American War of Independence. The situation ended with the royal family being taken by the crowd to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Officially, this move was meant to bring the king closer to the people, rather than off in Versailles. In reality, however, it also meant that the king was now surrounded by the new Paris Commune, the one place in the country that was most pro-republic and most anti-monarchy. It was even worse for Queen Marie, who did not enjoy even the limited popularity the king had. Increasingly feeling like a prisoner in her own capital, and not being supportive of the revolution to begin with, it did not take long for the queen to start working towards either restoring royal power or escaping Paris. The monarchy did have some allies, notably Mirabeau and Lafayette, who wanted to see a constitutional monarchy, and to even try to revive the queen's reputation. Marie collaborated with these efforts, even if she wanted a full restoration of the old order, and that she and Lafayette loathed each other. Naturally, the rumor mill spinned up a story about her and Lafayette having an affair, because of course they did. Mirabeau was a more agreeable ally to the queen, being probably the most influential figure in the assembly, actually wanting Marie to be accepted by the French people, and being open to taking gifts for these services on her behalf. But then Mirabeau's efforts came to an end on the 2nd of April 1791, after he caught a mild case of death at the age of 42. Mirabeau's taking of payments to work on behalf of the royal family would come out a few months later, and so ruin his reputation as one of the founders of the revolution. Lafayette's reputation was also ruined after he ordered his soldiers to open fire upon a mob in Paris on the 17th of July 1791 in what became known as the Champ de Mars massacre. With the attempts to restore the old order fading, the Queen convinced the king that it was time to start planning an escape attempt. The plan was put into motion on the 21st of June, 1791, but turned into yet another disaster for the monarchy when they were recognized and caught that same day at Varennes. The flight to Varennes destroyed the king's reputation, who was now viewed with hostility and suspicion, not at all helped by the letter Louis XVI had left behind, expressing his discontent with the course the revolution had taken. Now the monarchy really was effectively under house arrest in the Tuileries Palace, but the status of the royal family was now getting attention from foreign powers. The most notable power concerned was, not surprisingly, Austria, which was now ruled by Marie's older brother, Leopold II. Together with Prussia's King Frederick William II, the two monarchs made the Declaration of Pillnitz, stating their concern for the royal family and threatening invasion should anything happen to them. In response, and after Austria refused to pull its troops back from the border, France declared war on the 20th of April, 1792, and so began the chaotic conflict that would not truly end until after the Battle of Waterloo, 23 years later. The outbreak of war, and the passions war brings out, further aggravated the situation. The support the Austrians and Prussians gave to the émigrés, the exiled nobility that were dedicated to restoring the old order, made it seem as if the king was colluding with foreign invaders to restore his old powers. Such accusations were actually true when it came to Queen Marie, who passed military secrets to Austria in the hope that the revolution could be crushed. After a mob broke into the Tuileries Palace on the 20th of July 1792 and threatened the Queen, the Prussian armies marching towards Paris issued what would become known as the Brunswick Manifesto, stating that any harm done to the royal family would be paid back upon the population of Paris. Rather than being intimidated, the revolutionaries in Paris took it as a challenge. Their first response? Organizing a riot, the 10th of August assault upon the Tuileries Palace. The king's Swiss guards were killed or captured, the royal family was imprisoned in the Temple, formerly the headquarters of the Knights Templar, and the monarchy overthrown. Attendants of the royal family were also arrested, with the Princess de Lamballe, a close friend of the Queen, ending up getting butchered by a mob a month later during the September massacres. The princess was beheaded, and her head was paraded outside Queen Marie's window at the temple in the hopes that she would see it. She did not, but the news was deeply distressing all the same. Worse was to come. In the following months, the National Convention decided to put the king on trial for treason. I already went into detail about that trial in my earlier video on Charles-Henri Sanson, so I won't retread that here. The short version is that the king was found guilty, sentenced to death, and executed on the 21st of January, 1793. The queen was grief-stricken as she remained imprisoned, with her own fate now being debated. Worse came when, despite her best efforts to fight back, her son Louis Charles was then taken away from her on the 3rd of July, 1793, passing into the hands of the revolutionaries, who would soon turn the child against his mother. She would never see him again. Marie was finally put on trial on the 14th of October, 1793. Considering the extent and nature of the rumors that had plagued her during her entire life in France, the charges being made against her should not come as much of a surprise. Treason was one of them, and one that the queen was actually guilty of since she had passed military secrets to Austria. Less solid were the more wild accusations, such as having hosted orgies at Versailles. But the most vicious charge brought up was one of abuse and incest, with her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, who had been pushed into writing a letter in support of these accusations. Marie was aghast and horrified by this accusation, not wanting to even give it the dignity of a response. But the trial itself did not matter because the verdict had already been decided upon beforehand. Queen Marie was found guilty of all of it on the 16th of October, 1793, and was sentenced to death, to be carried out later that day. Marie would spend her last hours writing letters, including one to her daughter, the 14-year-old Marie-Thérèse, asking her to forgive her brother for his part in the trial. A few hours later, she was taken to the guillotine as the crowd looked on, glad to see the end of the one whom they blamed for much of the ills that had befallen France. Marie Antoinette's last words would be an apology for accidentally stepping upon the foot of her executioner. Marie Antoinette, guillotined on the 16th of October 1793 at the age of 37, was one of the first major victims of what would become the Reign of Terror. As for her children, her son Louis Charles would die 2 years later, at the age of 10, brutally mistreated in the time since he was taken away from his mother. Only her eldest daughter, Marie-Thérèse, would survive imprisonment and reach adulthood, being traded in a prisoner exchange with Austria in 1795 to live with her Habsburg cousins. There she would remain, until returning to France after the first fall of Napoleon in 1814, married her cousin, and was very briefly Queen of France as her mother was. And by brief, I mean she was queen for only about 20 minutes, the time between King Charles X's abdication and her own husband, the would-be Louis XIX, abdicating during the Revolution of 1830. She would spend the rest of her life exiled, first in Britain, and then in Austria, until her death in 1851 at the age of 72. Marie Antoinette remains a controversial figure in French history. To some, she symbolizes the worst aspects of the ancient regime, the extravagance, court intrigue, and resistance to reform. To others, she was used as a scapegoat for the failings of others, ultimately taking the fall for things she actually had very little to do with. As for myself, despite the tone I have taken throughout this video, I'm actually a bit mixed. She was clearly a victim of circumstance, and her life in the French court sounds like the worst middle school I could ever imagine. At the same time, she worked to maintain the power of a regime that was autocratic, did not look out for the best interests of its people, and which was ultimately overthrown because of its shortcomings. After having researched the life of Marie Antoinette for this video, I find myself sympathetic to her personal circumstances, but not to her efforts to keep power in such a flawed system. One thing I need to mention about Marie Antoinette concerns an infamous quote attributed to her. When told that the people of France were starving due to a lack of bread, Marie supposedly responded with the line, "Let them eat cake." This quote has become strongly identified with Marie, and is basically the prime example of a rich aristocrat being blatantly out of touch with the common people. There's just one small thing about this. Marie Antoinette never said it. The line actually comes from an autobiography written by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who mentioned having heard this line spoken by a great princess that he did not identify. The thing is, Rousseau wrote this book in 1765, 24 years before the outbreak of the French Revolution, and when Marie Antoinette was 9 years old and still living in Austria. The line only became attributed to Marie by a writer named Alphonse Karr in 1843, 50 years after Marie's death. Even after her death, Queen Marie could not escape slander. Now it is time to get into Marie Antoinette as shown in Fate Grand Order, starting with her character design. Unlike Sanson, there is no shortage of artworks depicting Marie, which makes sense, since she was royalty and had an interest in things of this nature. Appearance-wise, Marie was described as having ash blonde hair and blue eyes, both of which are consistent with how she is in FGO. As for the rest, however, it is a bit more problematic. Marie Antoinette was known for elaborate hairstyles and decorations, and so this is probably how we end up with that hat that she wears in all of her ascension forms. But as for the rest of her appearance, it seems to conform to a more modern idea of a bright and elegant young princess, rather than a queen. This does seem to be a deliberate design choice, since it is specifically mentioned in the Orléans Singularity that her servant form fits more with how she would have been during her teens before she became queen, rather than after. My final verdict is that the artist took a number of liberties with Marie's design, but it is not completely at odds with her historical counterpart. The vibe, at least, of an elegant, beautiful princess is very much there. At the very least, it certainly isn't the most bizarre change we have seen made. Moving on to Marie's skill set, her first skill is Royal Melody, which has a chance to charm a single enemy for a turn and increases the attack of all allies for 3 turns. Marie has already been noted as having had an excellent singing voice, as is having a friendly and charming demeanor. For those who would be on her side, her presence could be inspiring enough for this attack buff to make sense. Continuing from there, her second skill is Beautiful Princess, which grants her invincibility for 3 turns, and gives her healing every turn for 5 turns. This too makes sense, as Marie was a princess, and is regularly described as being beautiful, which isn't something that could be said for the other members of the Habsburg family. Lastly, her third skill is God's Grace, which increases her mental debuff success rate for 3 turns, and gives her a sizable heal. Ruling by the grace of God was a line often said when it came to medieval and the later absolute monarchs such as Queen Louis XVI, or indeed Queen Marie. Marie's whole skill set allows her to improve the allies alongside her, while also having quite a bit of defensive potential. Considering the amount of hostility she had to face in life, including at least 2 occasions of having to face a hostile mob threatening to kill her, I'd say Marie having this extra resilience is actually quite fitting. Her noble phantasm, Guillotine Breaker, this one is a bit more difficult for me to figure out. She hops onto that crystal horse that is in the background of her art image, then charges towards the enemy, causing more crystals to sprout up from the ground to damage all enemies. It also gives her yet more healing, removes party debuffs, and improves the party's critical damage for 3 turns. Now, Marie's interest in horseback riding has already been established. She got the rider class for a reason. But I must admit I'm a bit uncertain about the meaning behind what this MP is supposed to be, and so there's going to be some guessing being made. The name is an obvious reference to her death by guillotine, but the act of actually breaking a guillotine never comes up. All of the crystals that appear, though, might be a strong clue, since clear quartz can be symbolic of purity and healing, both of which are effects that Marie's MP has. This is just my supposition, but I would say that Marie's MP is meant to symbolize bringing light and healing, and so to counter the death that the guillotine represents. Feel free to ponder this further in the comments. Moving on to Marie's characterization, she was a major character and ally in the first Singularity, Orléans. As before, I'm not going to bother covering up spoilers for such an early storyline in FGO. Marie enters the Orléans story in the midst of a desperate battle against Jean Alter, and together with Mozart allows the protagonist, Mash, and the normal Jean to escape. Much is made of Marie's admiration of Jeanne d'Arc, which embarrasses Jean a bit at first, but they quickly become friends. Also, since she appeared together with Mozart, the two talk about having met during their childhood years before life circumstances interfered. Later on, Marie stays behind to let the party escape Jean Alter again, and so is forced to confront Sanson, who in the Fate world is the one who executed Marie. But against the odds, she manages to defeat him, only to then fall to Jean Alter afterwards. It is this final part of her story in Orléans that is particularly notable, since it is here that Marie talks to both Sanson and Jean Alter about her thoughts on the end of her life. What you end up getting here is a Marie that is quite forgiving and accepting of what happened to her, saying that she was only queen for the people, and so was removed when the people no longer wanted her. She does not even hold a grudge against Sanson for being her executioner. Marie is notably less forgiving when it concerns the fate of her son Louis Charles, but that is very understandable. As a whole, Marie is a well of positivity, compassion, and warmth to most everyone she comes across, a Pollyanna sort of character, and in my opinion is one of the better parts of the Orléans story. Her image of friendliness and warmth is what she shows openly to others, but there is more to Marie's characterization than that. In Marie's second interlude, you end up in a dream that takes place in the temple. the place where she was imprisoned during the final year of her life. In it, you come face to face with another, different Marie, vengeful, angry, and scornful of the Marie you have come to know. She curses France and seems perfectly content with the idea of humanity being incinerated. You do have to fight and overcome this other Marie, but the regular Marie admits that these darker feelings are also a part of her. That deep down, she does have feelings like this that she tries to keep out of sight of others. We see another example of this in an event, the Fate Requiem Collaboration Event, back in May 2022. The villain of this event story is a manifestation of the darkness and regrets inside of the event's main character, Utsumi Aris, but it takes the form of a dark Marie Antoinette. Her design here is noticeably different from the normal Marie, older, more queen-like, but also dressed in Marie's black mourning dress, and with the yellow eyes you so often see in altar versions of characters. Now this Marie is explicitly not Marie Alter, but Marie herself, who is present during this event and meets this dark Marie, says that this is not too far off from what an altar version of herself might look like. In personality, this dark Marie is much more in line with the image that people in France had of her, haughty, aloof, and seeing herself as above the masses. Now, the appearance of this dark Marie was quite an interesting twist, and in my opinion was probably the most notable part of the Fate Requiem collab event. It was certainly better than that damn board game. Unfortunately, so far we have yet to see this Marie Alter concept released as a servant in FGO, and to be honest, I don't think we will see it, at least for a while. Why do I say this? Because as neat as it is to have this alter version of Marie, the idea of having two separate versions of a major female character in French history, one positive and good, the other dark and bitter, is something we've already seen. Yes, Jeanne Alter has been an extremely popular character ever since she first appeared in Orléans, and I am certainly among her many fans. But because of the similarity between Jeanne and Jeanne Alter, and Marie and a potential Marie Alter, I'm doubtful that we will see an official Marie Alter servant. Unfortunately, it seems like Dark Marie will remain in NPC jail alongside other characters like Agravain, Akechi Mitsuhide, or the more recent Kamazots. I could be wrong about this though, and frankly, I want to be wrong about this, because a Marie Alter sounds cool to me. I mean, it might even lead to some fun character interactions with Jeanne Alter. Time will tell, I suppose. Marie Antoinette has a rather interesting depiction in Fate Grand Order, choosing to represent a younger teenage version of Marie, rather than the older queen so familiar to those interested in the history of the French Revolution. Despite this, we do still get glimpses of that older Marie here and there, either in comments that Marie makes, or by the introduction of event characters, like the Dark Marie from the Fate Requiem collab event. As a whole, liberties certainly have been taken with Marie's portrayal in FGO, but the essence of her character at least still seems to be intact. This is still recognizably Marie Antoinette, and not somebody who is acting blatantly out of character. For that reason, I'm okay with Marie's portrayal in FGO, and therefore, I'm not going to set her on fire. But for those of you disappointed because you want to see a servant barbecue, don't worry, we will get to those servants in due time. Queen Marie Antoinette may remain a controversial figure in French history, but in Fate Grand Order, she is a beacon of positivity that brightens most every situation that she is involved with. Vive la France! If you would like to learn more about the man who executed Marie Antoinette, or rather, the father of the man who executed her, check out my video on Charles-Henri Sanson right here. As expected for a historical figure with so much recorded about them, this video on Marie is the longest one so far, but hopefully you still found it interesting all the way through. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you have not done so, since more of these videos are in the making. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon.